When you think of tobacco, you probably think of growing it somewhere down south or maybe even in Cuba. But did you know that we grow tobacco right here in Western Massachusetts? Hi, I'm Lesley Lambert, a realtor with Park Square Realty, and I'm here to tell you a little story about broadleaf tobacco. So today I had an appointment, a real estate appointment in Southwick, and then a lunch appointment in Southwick with some friends. And I twice got stuck behind a tractor that was either full of tobacco heading from the field to a barn, or the tractor's empty going back to the field for their next fill up. I grew up in Southwick, Massachusetts. I lived there most of my young life and live all the way in the next town in Westfield now, so I went real far. But interestingly enough, I worked on the tobacco fields for a couple of years. Back then, it was common for high school kids to be a pretty large part of the labor force. I don't think it's like that anymore, but it was sort of a tradition that when you were a young teenager, often before you could drive a car, you worked the tobacco fields. And you start in the spring, and that's tying season. And then throughout the season, it's, all kinds of different jobs, and it ends up with picking and sewing the tobacco leaves so that they can be put into the barns to dry. Now, if you didn't know, broadleaf tobacco is largely used for cigars. And there is a rich history behind the tobacco fields of Southwick, Massachusetts. It goes back all the way to the 1600s, and it tracks back to a family name that is still affiliated with the farms today, and that's the Arnold family. I worked for the Arnolds when I was working on the tobacco fields. So in the morning, you would get up, as you can imagine, being a farm business, quite early, and you either got picked up by a bus and taken to the field, or in my case, I often rode my bike to the fields. And depending on what your job was, you dispersed out. If you were working under the nets, your job was usually either tying, weeding, picking, all those kinds of jobs. And let me tell you what, if you've never worked under a net in the heat of and humidity of a New England summer, then you haven't lived. Or maybe you have. It got hot under there. It was hot, really gross work. So as you're working with those leaves, the tar just accumulates. And now, I have very little body hair, very little, and I would still go home with just balls of tar stuck all over me. So between the fact that it was so hot under those nets and you were just drenched to the bone with sweat, and then the tar and the dirt under your fingernails, it was a pretty grubby job. One of my least favorite things about working tobacco, outside of all of that, was the tobacco worms. They're these big, green, chunky worms, and they're gross. And the boys working the field loved to torture the girls working the field with them. So after you pick the tobacco, it goes into a basket, and then the baskets get loaded and taken to the sewers, who are usually working in one of the barns. And once they're sewn, they get hung in the rafters to dry. So I happen to be one of the people that worked with the baskets, different jobs all throughout the year. So at this point, when it's picking season, I would pick sometimes, and sometimes I worked on the baskets. And when you're working with the baskets, you're taking them from the people, you're on a truck, you're taking them from the people below, you're loading them, and then you're unloading them when you get to the barn. Those poor sewers, the boys would often hide surprises in between the leaves of tobacco worms and other assorted, not so pleasant things that they would find throughout their day. So you had to be made of pretty tough stuff to do this job. And several of us did it for a couple of years. I will tell you, It was piecework, which means you get paid for how much you do, how much you tie, how much you pick, how much you sew, or at least it was then. I'm not sure how they get paid now because I'm not working tobacco anymore, thank goodness. But I was like 15 years old, and I made some pretty good spending money because I'm little, strong, and fast. And so, you know, I'd come home with what at the time I really thought was quite a lot of money. Did I save that money? No, I did not. I bought about 5,000 CDs and a whole lot of books because still do love to read books and listen to music. So I have the books and I have the CDs, but I don't have that money. What I do have is the memories of working alongside my friends, because even though it was tough and grubby work, we still managed to have a good time together. And I think, you know, at least living where we live in Western Massachusetts, it's important for kids to learn about manual labor in some fashion. They're either going to fall in love with farming or mechanics or whatever the manual labor might be, or they're going to decide, I don't ever want to do that again, and find another route. So obviously for me, I went the other route, ended up going to college and being a realtor. So just some tidbits and interesting facts. And if you stay with me, I've got a short clip that shows my adventures today, part of my adventures today. And I drove by, I'll show you one of those tractors that's full with the leaves. I drove by one of the fields that's still got plenty of plants in there, and one of the drying barns, so you could see what that looks like. So I hope you've enjoyed my little story about broadleaf tobacco. I love where I live. I loved growing up in Southwick. I don't live very far from there. I'm in and out of Southwick all the time. It's a great community. And if you have any questions ever about what is it like to live in Western MA, Western Massachusetts, Southwick in particular for this video, please reach out at any time. My contact information will be all over the place. And I'm always here to answer questions, even if it's just about the lifestyle. Even if you're not ready to make a move, but you're curious and you're researching things, I'm always here to have a chat with you and share another story. So until next time, stay tuned for the clips, but I'm Lesley Lambert, realtor with Park Square Realty, Southwick native, and I look forward to seeing you next video. So if you drive around Southwick, Massachusetts this time of year, you might get stuck behind one of these. Are you wondering what that plant is hanging off the back of the tractor? Well, that is tobacco. Yes, we grow tobacco in Western Massachusetts. If you're curious about life in Western Massachusetts, give me a shout. I'm Lesley Lambert with Park Square Realty.